Hi, my name is Amelia Grant, 24 years old, an honors graduate from Stanford University. Today was supposed to be the best day of my life, the day I walked across the stage to receive the degree I had earned with tears, sleepless nights, and years of solitude. But the moment the host called my name, from the VIP seats, my parents burst out laughing. The sound was sharp and cold, echoing across the crowded hall. My father spoke loudly enough for hundreds to hear. "We're truly lucky that this accident of ours managed to accomplish at least one decent thing." My mother laughed along, leaned over to whisper something to my younger brother Ethan, and the three of them laughed together. The crowd went silent. Cameras and phones froze midair. I stood there, my smile stiffening on my lips, feeling as if the whole world was waiting to see me crumble. But I didn't. I walked to the podium, took the microphone, and looked straight at where they Saturday. My voice was calm, but each word sliced through the air. "Thank you, but today isn't just graduation day. Today is the day the truth finally finds its place." The auditorium fell silent. And to understand why I said that, you need to know where the story began. I was born and raised in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon, a place where white fences and neatly trimmed lawns weren't just part of the scenery, but masks people wore to hide the cracks beneath. Every morning, our neighbor across the street, Mrs. Henderson, watered her tulips in a pastel silk dress. Meanwhile, my parents, Thomas and Helen Grant, made sure our home stood as the perfect picture of a proper family. From the outside, we looked ideal: a successful engineer father, an elegant stay-at-home mother, a bright son, and a well-behaved daughter. But inside, things were nothing like that. My father was a man who lived by pride and principles. He often said, "This family survives on reputation, not affection." Whenever he said that, my mother would nod as if it were gospel. Helen was obsessed with how others saw us, terrified that the neighbors might judge her as a failed mother if her son didn't become the family's pride. And unfortunately, Ethan, my younger brother, was exactly that symbol of pride they clung to. Ethan was 3 years younger than me, but from the moment he was born, he was treated like a treasure. When Ethan broke an antique vase, Mom only laughed and said, "It's okay, boys will be boys." But when I accidentally spilled a glass of water on the study desk, she snapped, "How can a girl be this clumsy?" Every word, every glance carried a clear message. Ethan was the light, and I was the shadow. No matter how hard I tried, I was never enough. I never understood why Mom often said, "If it weren't for you, we could have had a complete family." At first, I thought it was just a careless remark, but as I grew older, I began to hear the venom in her tone. It wasn't just disappointment, it was hatred. When I was 10, I won first place in the state science fair with a small project on renewable energy. That was the day I thought maybe, just maybe, my parents would finally be proud of me. I had prepared a short speech, imagined them hugging me after the announcement, but they never came. When I called home, Mom said coldly, "Ethan has a football game, we can't miss it." I stood on stage, holding the heavy trophy in my hands, staring at the empty seats I had reserved for them. In a crowd of parents cheering for their children, I was the only one without anyone standing to clap. After the ceremony, I saw them on the local news, smiling brightly in the stands of the high school stadium, holding Ethan, kissing his forehead as if it were the greatest moment of their lives. That night, I understood something: love in my house came with conditions. It was given only to those who made them feel admired. After that day, I started to withdraw. I spent hours in my room drawing and reading two worlds where I could finally breathe without being judged. My father once walked in, looked at my sketches, and said, "This brings no value to the family." My mother was even colder. "You live in a fantasy. No one needs a weak girl like you." I learned how to stay silent, how to smile to calm their anger, how to disappear to stay safe. Some nights, I could hear them arguing in the living room. If it weren't for her, I could have had another son. Mom's voice cracked. "You know it was because of birth complications, not her fault," Dad replied, though even his tone carried exhaustion. I curled up under the blanket, covering my ears, but that sentence kept echoing in my head. If it weren't for me, they could have had a complete family. I started to believe it. I began to think maybe I really was a mistake, a medical accident, a child who was never meant to be. So I tried harder, straight A's in every subject, volunteering after school, helping mom cook dinner, doing everything I could to make them proud. But nothing changed. Ethan only had to walk into a room and all eyes turned to him. He could come home late, lie, even get into fights at school, and they would still defend him, still call him their spirited young man. Meanwhile, if I said one wrong thing, Mom would look at me with that familiar mix of disdain and disappointment. Once, during dinner, Dad asked Ethan, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Ethan grinned. "I don't know yet, maybe a professional athlete." Dad laughed and patted his shoulder. "That's my boy." When it was my turn, I said softly, "I want to become a researcher." Dad shot me a glance. "Stop dreaming. Girls don't need to be that ambitious. Just behave and find a decent husband." My high school years were something I both wanted to forget and couldn't escape. I studied at a good public school in Portland, a place where everything revolved around reputation and ranking. I walked in carrying fears already carved into my bones, the fear of being wrong, of being judged, of not being enough. But the more I tried to avoid those fears, the more I found myself forced to face them. I spent most of my time in the library, quietly taking notes, studying ahead, joining research groups and academic competitions. I didn't have many friends, but teachers liked me for my persistence. By senior year, I was selected for the honors program and awarded a full state scholarship to Oregon. When the list was posted, I remember running home with a tiny spark of hope that maybe, this time, my parents would be proud. But when I handed them the acceptance letter, Dad barely glanced at it before setting it down. "Fine, at least you didn't embarrass us." Mom added coldly. "Let's just hope you don't make people think we favor your brother." Ethan, on the other hand, was different. He got suspended for 2 weeks for fighting on school grounds. They said he punched another student just because he was teased. I still remember sitting outside the principal's office when Mom laughed softly and said, "He's just a bit hot-headed. Boys will be boys." When they left the office, she placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, her voice filled with pride as if he'd earned a Medal of Honor. "At least you stand up for yourself, not like someone else I know." I knew she meant me, but I didn't react. I had long grown used to being the example she used to shame someone into behaving. The older I got, the clearer it became that fairness didn't exist in my family. Ethan could make mistakes and still be forgiven, while I only had to fall short of perfect to be considered a failure. So I stopped trying to make them love me, I just tried to make sure they couldn't ignore me. During my final semester of high school, I applied to Stanford. I didn't tell anyone. It was the first decision I ever made purely for myself. I spent countless nights awake, writing my essay about what it felt like to grow up in a home where silence was the only language I was taught. When the acceptance letter arrived, my hands trembled so badly that I had to read it 3 times to believe it. I thought I would cry, but I didn't. I just sat there quietly, smiling, feeling as if a small door inside me had finally opened. That evening, I handed the letter to my parents. My father read it, then set it down without expression. "Good. At least you won't be costing us money." My mother added, "Just don't do anything to embarrass us. No congratulations, no hug." They talked about how far Stanford was, how I should save money, how there was no need to call home often. I nodded, pretending it didn't hurt. But inside, I had already started packing my emotions, folding them away piece by piece. The day I left home, it was drizzling in Portland. I had exactly $300 in my wallet, one old suitcase, and a small notebook filled with goals I'd written for myself. Ethan was still asleep, not bothering to say goodbye. Mom stood by the door, arms crossed. "When you go out there, don't make people think we abandoned you," she said. I wanted to tell her that they had abandoned me long ago, but instead, I just smiled and replied, "I'll do my best." Dad drove me to the bus station. He didn't say a single word the entire ride. When I opened the door to step out, he said flatly, "Don't bother coming back if you fail." I sat in the last row, watching the familiar streets fade behind the rain-streaked window. Every house, every tree, every welcome to Portland sign blurred into the fog. I didn't know what the future would hold. I only knew that, for the first time in my life, I could breathe without being afraid someone might hear it. I had no family to send me off, no one saying they were proud of me, but I had something they could never take away: the belief that if no one was proud of me, I would be proud of myself. I didn't need their approval, I just needed a chance to rewrite what good enough truly meant. And I promised myself that one day, they would never call me a mistake again, because this mistake would become the one thing they could never deny. The first days at Stanford were a strange mix of fear and rebirth. I arrived with a small suitcase and what was left of my $300 after paying the first month's dorm fee. No one saw me off, no farewell dinner, no family photo taped beside my bed like the others had, and yet, I felt lighter. For the first time, I could breathe without tiptoeing around someone's expectations. I no longer lived in a house where every laugh came with conditions, where every small mistake was proof of failure. Stanford, with its ivy-covered walls and laughter-filled air, made me feel that maybe, just maybe, I was worthy of a new beginning. I found a part-time job at the university library, shelving books and manning the front desk in the evenings. It was simple work, but to me, it was an entire world of quiet: the smell of old paper, the soft sound of pages turning, the warm yellow glow of the lamps. There, I learned to love silence. During the day, I attended my general education classes, and at night, I tutored freshmen to earn a little extra money for books. Some nights, I stayed in the library until 3 in the morning, grading papers and calculating whether I still had enough money to eat for the rest of the week. But no matter how exhausted I was, I always felt I was moving in the right direction. Every page I turned was one small step further away from the shadow of that house in Portland. One afternoon, while I was organizing old archives in the library, an older man approached me. He wore glasses, a slightly wrinkled shirt, and held a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "You're the one who wrote the paper on AI applications in early Parkinson's detection, right?" he asked, his voice curious. I nodded, my heart racing. It was just an assignment for my medical technology class. I hadn't expected anyone to notice. He smiled. "I'm Professor Collins. I read your paper and found it intriguing. Do you have time to talk?" That sentence, simple as it was, opened an entirely new chapter in my life. We met later that week in his research office in the Northern Academic Complex. I explained my idea about using machine learning to detect early neurological complications through vocal data. He listened intently, then said slowly, "You have a rare way of thinking, a mix of intuition and logic. I'd like you to join my research group." I remember freezing for a moment. In that instant, all the years of being dismissed and called a mistake seemed to collapse into one single moment of validation. I accepted immediately. From that moment on, I became part of the AI medical research group led by Professor Collins. The work was demanding but deeply meaningful. We spent countless nights in the lab, surviving on cheap coffee and walls covered with sticky notes. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. No one cared where I came from, what my parents did, or whether I was anyone's pride. Here, I was simply Amelia, the girl who worked tirelessly to understand how technology could save lives. During discussions, I took careful notes but gradually learned to speak up, to let my ideas breathe. Professor Collins would often nod and say, "Don't be afraid to take up space. A person's true worth isn't defined by where they're born, but by the courage it takes to step beyond it." I carried those words with me through all my years at Stanford. In my junior year, our team was invited to present at a national conference on medical technology. I was the only student chosen to deliver the presentation. That morning, my hands were trembling with sweat, but when I saw Professor Collins's encouraging look, I began speaking and didn't stop for 20 minutes. When the applause erupted, I knew that every sleepless night, every quiet battle, had meant something. A month later, I received an email. A full scholarship for my final year, along with an invitation to be a commencement speaker. I stared at that message for a long time, feeling as though life was finally making amends for all the years I had been denied. Meanwhile, I still received the occasional text from home. Each message was about Ethan. Ethan just bought a new car. Ethan got into the semi-pro team. Ethan thinks you should come visit, he misses you. But I knew they didn't truly want me back. To them, I was a distant shadow useful only when they needed to brag about their daughter at Stanford, and forgotten right after. Later, I heard Ethan had dropped out after 2 years of college, saying the environment didn't suit his energy. My parents weren't upset. They even financed his so-called startup. I wasn't surprised. That was the unspoken law of our family. Ethan was forgiven. I had to prove myself. I continued living my life simple, quiet, but full of meaning. Some nights, I sat alone in my dorm room, watching the Stanford lights glow through the window, wondering if my parents were ever proud of me. But then I realized it no longer mattered. Every small success was proof that I didn't need to be born out of love to become someone worthy of it. I learned to cook for myself, fix my own bike, and take care of myself when I was sick. Slowly, I built a new kind of family: the friends in the lab, Professor Collins, and the people who believed in me when no one else did. The day I was chosen as the commencement speaker, I received the email while working at the library. I remember sitting there in silence for several minutes, my hands trembling. I couldn't believe it was meant for me, the girl once called a mistake, the one who'd been told that girls didn't need to try so hard. I stepped outside, stood beneath the red maple trees, and took a deep breath. Inside, I heard a quiet, steady voice. You did it. But alongside that pride came a quiet sadness. I wanted to share the news with someone, but there was no one to call. Eventually, I sent a short email to my parents. I've been selected as the commencement speaker for Stanford. They replied 3 days later, that's good. Just don't do anything to draw attention. I stared at the screen and smiled faintly. They still didn't understand that the very thing they called drawing attention was the reason I was still here. When my final year at Stanford was nearing its end, the graduation committee sent me a formal letter. Please list the family members you would like to invite to the honorary commencement ceremony. I stared at that paper for a long time. Dozens of names passed through my mind: Professor Collins, my research teammates, the librarian who always saved me coffee on late nights. All of them had been my anchors along this journey. But when my eyes stopped at the line labeled family name, my heart tightened. I knew exactly whose names I had to write. I hadn't called home in over a year, receiving only the occasional fragmented text from my mother, most of them about Ethan. And yet, for some reason, I still wrote down Thomas Grant and Helen Grant. Maybe I did it for myself, as a way to close the debt I owed to something called final filial duty. 2 weeks later, I flew back to Portland. The flight was short, but it felt like a lifetime. As the plane descended, I looked out the window and saw the mist-covered mountains and the familiar stretches of suburban rooftops. Everything looked the same, only I had changed. I rented a small car and drove through the old streets. Every curve, every road sign pulled me back into a memory. The street where I used to bike to school. The bakery where Mom bought Ethan his first birthday cake. The grassy hill where I used to sit alone reading. When I finally stopped in front of our old house, my heart pounded hard. The house had been repainted a soft cream, the porch decorated with new flower pots, still perfect, as always. Perfect to the point of being artificial. I stood at the door for a moment, took a deep breath, and rang the bell. My mother opened the door. She looked at me for a few seconds, her gaze scanning me from head to toe as if assessing a stranger. "Amelia, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice briefly faltering. I forced a small smile. "I came to invite you and Dad to my graduation ceremony at Stanford." Her eyebrows lifted, her lips curving into a faint, polite smile. "Oh, graduation? Well, that's nice. We'll see if your father's free." Her tone was gentle, but the way she said it made my chest tighten. There was no hug, no, "we're proud of you." Only the cold distance between two people who happened to share the same last name. When I stepped inside the house, it felt like walking into a museum where every trace of me had been erased. On the living room wall, the family photos still hung neatly in perfect alignment, but every single one showed only 3 people. My father, my mother, and Ethan. The picture of me at 16, holding my scholarship award, was gone. The painting I once gave my mother had vanished too. Even my state science trophy, the one thing I used to cherish most, was nowhere to be found. In their place were rows of sports medals, photos of Ethan in his baseball uniform, and one of him shaking hands with the local mayor. The entire house seemed curated to glorify one person, and that person wasn't me. I asked quietly, "Mom, where are my old photos?" She smiled and shrugged. "Probably stored somewhere. We cleared things out during the renovation. You know, it looks messy when guests see old pictures everywhere." Her tone was light, but I felt as if someone had just pulled me out of my own history. My father came in from the garage, still carrying that same stern demeanor. He shook my hand stiffly. "Hello. Stanford, home? That's good." Then he turned to my mother. "Where's Ethan?" "He went out, probably meeting friends," she replied. It was as if merely saying Ethan's name was enough to bring life into the house. I stood there, surrounded by people who shared my blood, yet felt like a guest renting space in the home where I grew up. That afternoon, I took a walk around the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who used to give me cookies, called out to me. "Amelia, is that really you? My goodness, you've changed so much. Haven't seen you in ages." She took my hand, her eyes kind but her voice dropping slightly. "People talk, you know, those 2 kids of yours so different, not alike at all." I gave an awkward smile, trying to joke. "Maybe it's just dominant and recessive genes." She chuckled softly, but there was something in her gaze that made me uneasy. As I walked back home, her words echoed in my mind like a single off-key note in the worn-out melody of my memories. That night, I sat in my old room, a room that had been repainted a different color. The shelves that once held my books were empty, replaced by a few boxes of Ethan's things. I opened my suitcase and took out the printed invitation to my graduation ceremony, planning to give it to my parents in the morning. But then, from the living room, I heard my mother's voice talking to a neighbor. Her words carried clearly through the thin door. "I'm so lucky Ethan turned out well, successful, respectful. That girl, though, she's just a consequence. If it weren't for her, I would have had a complete family." I froze. The word echoed in my ears like shards of glass. Consequence. 24 years of living, and never had anyone defined my existence so cruelly. I sank to the floor, my hands trembling. Memories flooded back, the times I was called a mistake, the endless comparisons, the dinners where I stayed quiet just to avoid making them uncomfortable. All of it came together like pieces of a puzzle, revealing the picture I had refused to see. In this family, I had never been loved. I had thought time would heal it, that distance and success would change how they saw me. But no. To them, I was still what I had always been, a mistake, a scar that never faded. I stepped out into the backyard, where the maple tree I had planted still stood, taller than the roof now. Under the pale moonlight, I saw the carving I had made when I was 12. "One day, they'll be proud of me." I ran my fingers over the faint letters as tears rolled down my cheeks. Maybe I had been wrong to ever hope for that. When someone doesn't want to see you, even if you stand right in front of them, they'll pretend you never existed. I couldn't sleep that night. My mother's voice kept looping in my head, her words slicing through me. "She's just a consequence." The next morning, I woke up in that same room with a dull ache behind my eyes, as if sleep had refused to come. Pale light filtered through the curtains, tracing tiny cracks across the walls. The smell of coffee drifted up from the kitchen, mixed with the faint clinking of a spoon against a cup, steady, cold, distant. Everything felt peaceful in a way that was painfully fake. I sat up, pulling a light sweater around me, feeling hollow. Maybe it was because her words still echoed somewhere in my mind. Ethan was the child we wanted. Amelia was just the consequence. I walked downstairs, trying to act normal. Mom was cleaning the kitchen, Dad was reading the newspaper, and Ethan hadn't come home yet. No one looked at me. It felt as if I were a faint shadow moving through a house where every corner belonged to someone else. I planned to leave early to return to Stanford before the ceremony. But as I began packing my things, I realized my small silver necklace, the one I used to wear in high school, was missing. It was one of the few gifts my father had ever given me, even though he never said the words, "I love you." I remembered leaving it in the drawer of my mother's study years ago when she told me, "Keep it here, it's safer." I hesitated. It had been so long since I'd stepped into that room. But I wanted that necklace back, not because of its value, but because it was one of the few memories they hadn't managed to erase. I knocked softly. No response. The room smelled faintly of old wood and perfume. The desk was neatly arranged, with folders, pens, and a few photo albums stacked in perfect order. I opened the top drawer, then pulled at the lower one, the place where I remembered leaving the necklace. It wasn't there. I searched through a few boxes, shuffled through sealed envelopes. Then, almost by accident, I picked up a thin folder, its edges yellowed with age. The title on the cover read, "Ethan Grant, Adoption Record." I blinked, thinking I'd misread it. But as I looked closer, the words beneath made my stomach drop. Adopted at age 2, Oregon Family Services. My throat went dry. I sank to the floor and opened the folder. Inside was an official document bearing the clear signatures of Thomas and Helen Grant. The date was written in firm, deliberate handwriting. The 14th of June, 2003. I stared in disbelief. I turned the page and there it was, an old medical report, the print faded but still legible. Postpartum complications, permanent infertility confirmed. I didn't need to be a doctor to understand. That cold, clinical line meant my mother had been unable to have any more children after giving birth to me. I dropped the folder, my heart pounding wildly. The air in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating. A strange sensation rose in my throat, not fear, but shock. Suddenly, everything made sense. I saw it all with painful clarity. Every word, every glance, every moment they chose Ethan over me. They couldn't have any more children, and I, the only child who survived, was the reason their dream of having a son had been destroyed. Instead of being grateful that I lived, they blamed me for taking away my mother's ability to bear another child. And to fill that void, they adopted Ethan, the boy who embodied everything they had always wanted. I could see the pattern connecting every wound of the past 22 years, from every "you were a mistake" to every cold stare that met my achievements. It wasn't just favoritism. They resented me because I reminded them of a loss they could never accept. I looked down at the photo tucked inside the folder. A little boy, around 2 years old, with blonde hair and bright, smiling eyes. Beneath it read, "Healthy, bright child, adjusting well." A sweet, innocent child, the one they chose to replace me. My tears came fast and uncontrollably. Not out of jealousy, but because it was all so clear, so cruel. I closed the file gently, my hands trembling, and sat back against the cabinet. My mind kept repeating one thought. So this was all because of me. The day I was born, something else in them died. I felt a strange sorrow, not just for myself, but for them too. Maybe my mother never truly hated me as a person. Maybe she hated the memory I carried, the reminder of what she had lost. But no matter the reason, I was still the one who had to grow up in a house where love existed only for the ghost of a child they could never have. I took out my phone and snapped photos of the documents. I didn't even know why, maybe to prove to myself that this wasn't a dream. Everything was real, painfully real. I heard footsteps in the hallway and quickly closed the drawer. My heart pounded as my mother called out, "Amelia, breakfast's ready. You're going to be late." I replied softly, "Okay, I'll be right down." My voice sounded strangely calm, but deep down, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. Before leaving the room, I looked back at the wooden desk where the folder lay motionless. Morning light streamed through the window, landing on the words "adopted at age 2" as if to underline the truth. I whispered quietly, barely audible. So it wasn't that I wasn't good enough, I just never had a chance. When I went downstairs, Mom was still pouring coffee, Dad reading the newspaper as usual. Neither of them noticed that anything had changed. I sat down, picked up a glass of water, and looked out the window. The Portland sky was unusually clear that morning, but inside me, something had quietly shattered, peaceful yet irreversible. I didn't feel anger anymore, just emptiness. A kind of hollow space that no one could ever fill, but within that emptiness, for the first time, I knew. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't weak, and I wasn't a mistake. I was the truth they had chosen to bury for 22 years. I stood up, smiled faintly, and said softly, "I need to get ready for the graduation ceremony." Mom nodded without looking up. Dad answered with a quiet, "Okay." They had no idea that when I walked out that door, I carried everything with me: the evidence, the pain, and the freedom. I didn't need to confront them. The morning of graduation, the sky over Stanford was impossibly blue, yet my heart felt unbearably heavy. The campus shimmered with banners and flowers, flags fluttering in the breeze, the orchestra tuning their instruments, and thousands of students in black gowns forming a long line along the entrance. I stood among them, but somehow felt like a quiet pause in the middle of all that celebration. When my name was called first on the valedictorian list, the crowd erupted into applause, cheers from friends, flashes from cameras, but all I felt was a slow, quiet unease. I knew they would come. I knew that today wouldn't just be a graduation ceremony, it would be the stage where a 22-year-old secret would finally surface. As I walked toward the guest area, I saw them immediately. My parents sat in the VIP section, the seats reserved for the families of honorary speakers. My mother wore a pale blue dress, her white pearl necklace gleaming in the morning sunday. My father sat beside her, dark sunglasses hiding most of his face. Ethan sat next to them, handsome and confident, as if this ceremony were his own moment of glory. When our eyes met, my mother smiled, polite, restrained, the kind of smile you give to an acquaintance, not to your daughter. My father gave a brief nod, and Ethan waved casually before whispering something that made them all laugh. I stood still, feeling my chest tighten. Part of me wanted to believe they were here out of pride. But I knew better now. The ceremony unfolded in a rhythm of formal speeches and orchestral music. The host read names, one after another, each followed by applause and joyful shouting. I sat in the front row, waiting for my moment. When the MC stepped up to the microphone, his voice rang out clear and steady. "And now, please welcome our valedictorian recipient of the full scholarship and author of the groundbreaking study on artificial intelligence in medicine, Amelia Grant." The hall erupted in applause. I took a deep breath, stood, and climbed the steps to the stage. Every pair of eyes turned toward me. But just as I stepped onto the stage, a loud laugh broke out from the front row. I recognized the voice instantly. It was my father's. "That's our little accident up there," he said clearly, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. A soft chuckle from my mother followed, then her whisper. "At least she managed to do one decent thing before getting old." A few people turned to look at them, others turned to look at me. I froze. Blood rushed to my face, my hands trembling so hard I nearly dropped my speech. The host gave an awkward smile. Please, let's maintain silence so the ceremony can proceed." But their laughter kept echoing in my mind, every word slicing into me like a blade. Accident. This time, they hadn't said it at home, or to the neighbors. They said it in front of 1,000 people. I looked down and saw my mother leaning toward my father, laughing as if she were watching an amusing play. Ethan smirked faintly, whether out of embarrassment or habit, I couldn't tell. Around them, whispers began to ripple through the crowd. A girl in the third row murmured, "Did she really say that? Did her parents actually call her that?" A local reporter turned his camera toward their row, capturing the scene of 3 people sitting there, calm, unashamed, and unbothered. I took a deep breath. In that instant, all the pain, all the humiliation of the past years burned together into a single, steady flame inside my chest. My voice rang out, calm but firm. "Thank you to my parents for being here today." The hall fell silent. I continued. "Thank you for the reminder that sometimes the most beautiful thing you can do is to stop staying silent." I placed my prepared speech aside. I didn't need it anymore. This wasn't a speech, it was the truth. They've called me a mistake, an accident. But maybe today I should clarify something. Without this so-called mistake, they would have never had their perfect son. Oh, the whispers vanished. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my chest. The spotlight from the cameras shifted toward my face. I looked straight at the front row, at my parents frozen in place. Because Ethan, I said slowly, each word hanging in the air. The one they worshipped so dearly was never their biological child. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Someone dropped a camera, others covered their mouths. I stood still, my gaze locked on them. My mother's face went pale, her lips trembling soundlessly. My father sat rigid, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Ethan turned toward them, his face drained of color. I went on, my voice steady, even though my hands had gone cold. I know this isn't easy to hear. But sometimes, the truth needs to be spoken not to humiliate anyone, but to end the silence. For 22 years, I was called a consequence, blamed for being the reason they couldn't have more children. But what they never said is that they adopted Ethan when he was 2 years old. And I, the one they called a mistake, am the only child actually born into this family. The room fell into complete silence. No one moved. I could hear the faint hum of air brushing against the microphone. The host stood frozen. Photographers raised their cameras, flashes flickering across the hall. I looked down and saw my mother clutching her chest, my father whispering something harshly in her ear. Ethan just stared at me, his eyes red, uncertain whether from anger or pain. But I knew the truth had left my lips and it could never be buried again. I bowed my head slightly and stepped away from the podium. No applause came at first. The hall stayed silent for several long seconds before someone in the back began to clap, softly. Then another joined. The sound spread like a wave, quiet, but powerful. As I descended the steps, a strange calm washed over me. The fear was gone. The weight was gone. I walked past the VIP row, where my mother sat with her head bowed. My father turned his face away, and Ethan still looked at me, his lips trembling as if to speak but unable to form words. I simply said, softly enough for them to hear, "The truth doesn't destroy anyone, it only breaks the shell." Outside, sunlight flooded the wide green lawn, and the Stanford church bells echoed through the air. I stood in the middle of the crowd, feeling perhaps for the first time in my life truly alive. Not as a mistake, but as proof that even from the deepest pain, one can still rise and claim their own name. Cameras were still rolling, people were still whispering, but none of it mattered anymore. Because today, I had graduated not just from Stanford, but from the past that had imprisoned me for 22 years. The news spread faster than I could have imagined. Just a day after the ceremony, the video of my speech was everywhere on social media, shared and replayed with sensational headlines. Stanford valedictorian exposes family secret during graduation speech. Even the local Portland newspaper ran a front-page story with my parents' photo, captioned, "The Grant Family Community Icons or a Manufactured Illusion." I read every article with a strange mix of disbelief and ache. I had never meant to destroy them. I just wanted the truth to be heard once. But seeing their names printed beneath every headline, I understood that nothing could ever go back to the way it was. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages poured in from old classmates in Portland, from neighbors, even from strangers. "You're so brave. Amelia, I always thought you came from a perfect family. You did what so many of us never could." But mixed among them were others, bitter and cruel. What kind of daughter humiliates her parents in public? So proud of yourself? Try ungrateful instead. I stared at the glowing screen, a rush of emotions churning inside me, relief tangled with emptiness. I knew that by speaking the truth, I had accepted everything that would follow. 3 days later, I heard from an old friend in Portland that my parents had been removed from the board of St. Andrew's Church, the same church where they'd once been praised as the model family every Sunday. People were talking everywhere, in the market, online, in community groups. Some expressed pity, while others smirked with quiet satisfaction as the mask of perfection finally slipped. My father, a man who lived and breathed for reputation, must have felt that humiliation more deeply than any words I'd ever spoken. But I didn't feel joy, only sadness, a quiet kind of sadness, like watching an old house collapse, even when you've long known there's no place for you inside it anymore. That afternoon, there was a knock at my dorm room door. When I opened it, I froze. Ethan stood there. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. I had never seen him like that, no trace of confidence, none of the usual arrogant smile. "Sis," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "Is it true?" I was silent for a moment. Then I walked to my desk, opened the drawer, and took out the envelope I'd kept since the day I left Portland. I handed it to him. "Read it yourself." Ethan's hands trembled as he opened the envelope, pulling out the old papers, the adoption certificate, the medical report confirming my mother's infertility after giving birth, and the faded photo I'd found in the drawer, my parents holding a blonde toddler, the note beneath it reading, "Ethan, adopted, age 2. Nah. He stared at the documents, eyes wide and dazed. After a long silence, he let them fall from his hands, the papers scattering across the floor. "God," he whispered. "So, all those years, all the times they defended me, made you feel unwanted. It was because of this?" I didn't answer. I just looked at him, seeing in his face the same disbelief I once felt the moment you realize you've been deceived by the people you loved most. Ethan sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "You must hate me." I shook my head gently. "No. You didn't cause this. I didn't expose you to punish anyone. I just told the truth. No one should have to pay for someone else's lies, but the truth can't stay buried forever." He looked up, his eyes glistening. "No matter what, you're the only one who's ever been honest with me." His words tightened something in my chest. In that moment, I understood clearly Ethan never chose where he came from, just as I never chose the way I was born. We were both victims of two people who lived for the illusion of perfection. I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't owe me anything," I said softly. "But don't live in lies anymore. You deserve the chance to be who you really are." He nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. Then he stood, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm leaving home. I need to find out who I am, not who they want me to be." When the door closed behind him, I sat in silence. A part of me hurt, but another part felt lighter. Ethan had finally woken up. Maybe that was the best thing I had done amid all the chaos. That evening, my phone rang. The screen lit up with the word home, a name I had never changed. I hesitated for a few seconds before answering. My mother's trembling voice came through. "Amelia, you have to help us. People are talking at church, among our friends, your father's colleagues. You know we can't let this spread any further. You have to fix it. Tell them you spoke out of anger." I could hear my father in the background, his voice harsh but strained. "You're destroying this family's reputation." I closed my eyes and took a slow, steady breath. Then I spoke, calm and deliberate. "I didn't destroy anything. I told the truth. The consequences belong to you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then my mother began to sob. "We raised you, gave you everything, and this is how you repay us?" I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes when pain has nothing left to take. "You didn't raise me out of love, Mom. You raised me out of fear, fear of what people would say if you failed. And now, they're saying the opposite, aren't they?" My father's voice exploded through the phone. "Enough. You'll regret humiliating your own parents like this." I answered steadily, without hesitation. "No, Dad. I'm just not afraid anymore. The truth isn't meant to humiliate anyone. It's meant to set you free." I hung up before they could say another word. For the first time in my life, my hands didn't shake when I ended a call with them. "Chat GPT đã nói." In the days that followed, I was invited to speak at a university seminar titled "The Power of Truth and Personal Courage." I shared my story not with anger, but with the calm of someone who had already walked through the storm. A student raised her hand and asked, "Do you regret it?" I answered, "If I had to choose again, I'd still speak." Because silence is how people bury themselves alive. The rumors eventually faded. My parents' house drew its curtains shut, a quiet for sale sign hanging in the front yard. I heard they'd left Portland, moving to a smaller town to escape the eyes and whispers. As for me, I returned to my work in Seattle, continuing research with Professor Collins's team. Every time I passed the lab, I would still remember that day, the blinding light, the pounding of my heart, and the last words I spoke before stepping off the stage. Those words didn't just change my life, they ended a chain of lies that had stretched for more than 2 decades. I left Stanford soon after, carrying with me an honors degree, a few suitcases of books, and something no one could ever take away from me: freedom. I moved to Seattle, the city of rain and fog-covered mornings. There, I began my life anew, not as the daughter of the Grant family, but simply as myself. Amelia. A woman shaped by old wounds and new resolve. I was hired by a medical technology company developing AI tools for early neurological diagnosis. For the first time, I worked in an environment where worth was measured by results, not by your last name. No one mentioned my past, no one called me a mistake. They just saw me as a colleague, someone capable of contributing. And for me, that alone was enough to finally feel like I belonged in this world. I bought a small apartment by Lake Union. It wasn't big, but it had a balcony facing the water, where every morning sunlight poured through the glass doors, filling the room with a warm, golden glow. I spent entire weekends redecorating every corner, hanging my own paintings on the walls, the ones I had never dared to show anyone in my old house. They weren't perfect, but every brushstroke carried a piece of me, the part that had been suffocated for so many years. One afternoon, while browsing at a nearby pet shop, I noticed a small caramel-colored puppy trembling in the corner. There was something in its eyes, fear mixed with a longing to trust. I knew that feeling. So I brought him home and named him Milo. From that day on, the apartment was no longer silent. Every morning, Milo would chase his shadow across the wooden floor, and every night, he'd curl up beside me while I worked late. Once, I joked to him, "At least you'll never call me a mistake." Milo looked up, wagged his tail, and gently licked my hand, and in that moment, I realized that sometimes love is simple. It doesn't need words. One autumn evening, while working late at the office, I received an email from a nonprofit organization called Breaking the Silence, which supports people who have survived emotional abuse in their families. They invited me to be the keynote speaker at their upcoming conference, titled Healing Through Truth. I read the invitation several times. Part of me was scared, but another voice inside whispered, "It's time." So I said yes. On the day of the conference, the community center hall in Seattle was packed. Every seat was filled, faces, both young and old, people carrying the same kind of wounds I once had. When I stepped onto the stage, I saw their eyes, nervous, fragile but shining with hope. I smiled and began to tell my story. Not to blame anyone, but to show that sometimes things have to break before they can be rebuilt. I told them about the day my parents called me a mistake in front of thousands, how my hands shook but I still spoke the truth, and how, after everything, I never regretted it. As the session neared its end, a young woman raised her hand. "Have you ever forgiven them?" she asked. I looked at her, silent for a few seconds, then replied, "Forgiveness isn't for their peace, it's for mine." The room fell completely still. I continued, "Because when you forgive, you're not saying what they did was right. You're saying you won't let it define who you become." Afterward, many people stayed behind to hug me, crying, telling me they had found a bit of courage through my story. When I left, my heart felt light. For the first time, I didn't feel like a survivor, I felt like someone truly alive. Sometime later, I began thinking about the children who were like me once, those who weren't loved, weren't believed, who had to grow up in silence. I remembered standing on that stage at 10 years old, holding a trophy while no one clapped, and I thought to myself, no child should ever feel like they are a mistake. So I started a small project, a scholarship fund called Second Chance. I used part of my savings, gathered support from my company, my friends, and even some of the people who had attended my talks. The fund was for students who had been neglected or mistreated but kept fighting to rise above it. I wanted to give them what I had once longed for, a chance to see their own worth. In the first month, the fund could only support 3 students. One of them was a 17-year-old Mexican girl named Clara, who had been thrown out of her home by her father for not being obedient enough. When I met her, she said softly, "I don't think I'm worth anyone investing in." I smiled and told her, "You don't have to be worth it, you just have to believe that you can." When she received her scholarship, Clara burst into tears. In her eyes, I saw a reflection of myself from years ago, lost, afraid, but still holding a small, steady flame that refused to go out. Ethan visited me in Seattle from time to time. He had rented a small apartment near Portland and started working as a youth fitness coach. One day, he showed up with a bouquet of sunflowers. "For you," he said. "You're the reason I had the courage to start over." I smiled and hugged him. Things could never go back to the way they were, but, at least, among the ashes, we had found something real: brotherhood, late but genuine. That night, I sat on my balcony, Milo's head resting on my lap, the city lights shimmering across Lake Union. I thought about everything: the lonely nights, the cruel words, the wounds I once believed would never heal. But now, they weren't wounds anymore. They were scars I carried proudly, proof that I had survived. I used to think happiness would come only when my parents finally accepted me, but now I knew true happiness begins when you no longer need their approval. One early summer afternoon, nearly 2 years after moving to Seattle, I decided to return to Portland. Not out of nostalgia, but because I needed closure. I drove along the I-5 highway, the same road I had taken years ago, in the opposite direction, carrying $300 and a fragile belief that I could survive without them. The sky was gray and heavy that day, clouds hanging low, the same color as my childhood sky, muted, weighty, and quiet. When I turned onto my old street, where the houses still stood neatly side by side as if nothing had changed, my heart tightened. Everything looked frozen in time. Only I was different. The house appeared behind the same white fence, still standing just as I remembered. But what stopped me in my tracks was the tilted "for sale" sign swaying slightly in the breeze. The windows were shut tight, the curtains drawn, the front yard buried under a layer of dry leaves. No sound of my mother trimming flowers, no warm light spilling from the living room window at dusk. Just an empty house, cold and hollow, like the shell they had built around their lives. I turned off the engine and sat there for a long moment. In the rearview mirror, I saw my reflection: not the frightened girl I used to be, not the daughter waiting for approval, but a woman who had walked through pain and learned how to stand tall. I stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the fence. Each step on the brick path stirred a memory. I remembered sitting on those front steps, waiting for them to come home, hoping for a word of praise that never came. I remembered the nights I stood by the window, watching the neighbors' lights and pretending it was my home, one filled with laughter and warmth. Now, all of that was gone. I ran my hand along the wooden fence. The white paint was peeling, revealing small cracks underneath. I whispered, almost to myself. In the end, they lost the very thing they chose over me. My voice wasn't bitter, it was calm, almost peaceful. The kind of peace that comes only after you've let go. I walked around to the backyard. The old maple tree still stood there, tall but brittle at the roots. The carving I had made as a child was still faintly visible on its trunk. One day, they'll be proud of me. I smiled as tears slipped down my cheeks, but they no longer burned. I didn't need them to be proud anymore. I was proud of myself. I had turned the word mistake into momentum, transformed their cruelty into strength, and built a life that was my own. If they could never see my worth, that was no longer my burden to carry. I sat down on the front steps, the same place where I used to cry every time I was scolded. But this time, I sat there in peace. I looked out at the sunlit street, where a few children rode their bikes past, their laughter echoing through the air. Life goes on, with or without us. A soft breeze drifted by, carrying with it the scent of old wood, of memories, and of freedom. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and in that moment, I felt a complete sense of closure, not born from hatred, but from gratitude. Because without those dark years, I might never have known how precious the light of freedom truly is. Before leaving, I took a small piece of paper from my pocket and scribbled a few words. Thank you for teaching me how not to become like you. I folded it and tucked it beneath a stone on the porch. No one would read it, and maybe no one needed to. I just needed to know that I had returned the past to where it belonged. As I got into my car, I looked back one last time. The for sale sign swayed gently in the wind, like a quiet reminder that everything can be lost, even the things we once thought would last forever. To everyone watching until this final moment, maybe you, too, carry wounds like mine, being misunderstood, underestimated, or made to believe you were never enough. But remember this: your worth isn't defined by how others see you, but by how you rise after being rejected. The truth may hurt, but it's also the first door that leads to freedom. If someone once called you a mistake, don't waste your life proving them wrong. Live so brightly that you become undeniable proof that you were the best thing life ever created. Because not everyone who leaves is a loss. Sometimes, only when they're gone do you finally have the space to find yourself. Forgive, but don't forget. Move forward, but never bow your head. And believe peace doesn't come from being loved the right way. It begins the moment you start loving yourself. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.